And now for something completely different. It's time for another English whisky. This is the standard release from the Cotswolds distillery in England. And your eyes are not deceiving you, this is a very small bottle. It's a 200ml bottle, which I received as a gift from my girlfriend's family when they were in the area. Anyone that's been watching this channel for a while will know that St George's Distillery in Norfolk is my local distillery. And anyone that's kept up with their English whisky distilleries will know that St George's Distillery have fairly recently rebranded themselves as the English. Now, St George's Distillery in Norfolk, they were the first English whisky distillery of modern times, but these days they're definitely not the only English whisky distillery, with the likes of Adnams, Bimber and the Lakes Distillery joining the game. So Cotswolds whisky, is it any good? So a little bit of an introduction to the Cotswolds distillery. I'm sure that anyone that lives in England that has a look at their supermarket whisky aisle has probably seen this, because it is very available these days. It's popping up in the likes of Tesco and other UK supermarkets, and I think for a fairly good price as well. In the supermarkets and on the online specialist spirits retailers, as well as on the Cotswolds own website, you can get a full 700ml bottle of this stuff for under £40. So for a new distillery, they've not been around for an awful long time, I think that's a fairly reasonable price. The Cotswolds distillery itself has been around for nearly 10 years, established in 2014, and they're a very traditional distillery, following on in the Scottish single malt mould as a lot of English distilleries are. So Cotswolds Distillery, they're operating a pair of copper pot stills made in Forsyths in Rothes. It's made from 100% malted barley, and that malted barley is sourced from Warminster maltings in Wiltshire, England, just like a lot of the Scottish distilleries. So just like a lot of the distilleries in Scotland now are doing with your things like the Bruichladdich Scottish barley releases, this English whisky is made with malted barley from the distillery's home country. And that's definitely something to be proud of. It's something that I'm proud of, and hopefully the distillery itself is proud of, because English barley is some of the finest barley in the world. East Anglia in particular produces, I think, more barley than any other region of the UK, and because of the land that we have here, it's some of the best barley in the world. Warminster maltings have been malting English barley since 1855, and something that's really good about Warminster is that it's all floor malted, just like what you see if you do the distillery tour of the floor maltings at Lafroig or Kilchoman, Bowmore or Balvenie on the mainland. The barley is steeped and then laid out on the germination floors and actually turned by hand. So just like those Scotch distilleries that brag about hand malting their own barley, this whisky from the Cotswolds distillery has exactly the same bragging rights, which in a way gives this a little bit of a one-up over the Scottish distilleries, because I think with the exception of Springbank, all of those Scottish distilleries that have their own floor maltings, I don't think any of them really use a high percentage of their own floor malted barley in the product, possibly also with the exception of the 100% Islay releases from Kilchoman. But most of them, if you're talking about someone like Lafroig, who is very proud of their floor maltings, the average whisky made at somewhere like Lafroig might only have 10-15% of their own floor malted barley, with the rest being made up from the industrially malted product from Port Ellen maltings. Other details about this whisky in particular, I'm thrilled to say that this is, in my opinion, an integrity bottling. There's not an age statement on it. When this was first released, which I think was in 2017, it was billed as a 3-year-old whisky because it was their first release, and I would imagine that this is probably still around the 3-year-old mark. I don't think that it's changed a huge amount from when they first released this to this bottling that I've got here. Now, the problem with these miniature or small gift bottles is that some of them can be slow-moving inventory, so this may not be an incredibly current representation of the whisky from Cotswolds, but I'm going to work with what I've got. So 46% ABV, it is non-chill filtered and it's natural colour. Some more information that I find really interesting that I've dug up on the distillery is that they're proud that they don't use cask finishes. everything that goes into this, and I'm told all of their other releases, it's all matured full term. And that's something that I really like, because cask finishes, as championed by people like Glenmorangie, they can work. They can work really well sometimes. But I think a lot of the time, especially when you're looking at a young whisky, I'm always very cautious that it's a shortcut to maturity or it's covering something up. And sometimes that's deliberately covering things up, but sometimes it's unintentional as well, because in my opinion with a cask finished whisky you lose so much from the base distillate, whatever was there, be it good or bad. So it's really good that they're not using any cask finishes at all at the Cotswolds. We're also told that all of the casks that they're using at Cotswolds, unlike at St George's Distillery, are first fill. Now, I'm in a little bit of two minds as to what I think about that, because on the one hand, it's a guarantee of quality, because you know that those casks, providing they're good to start with, they will be used once and you're getting a fresh cask and hopefully an active, good quality cask on every maturation. On the other hand, I do hope that eventually they might start using some refill casks, because in my opinion, you don't necessarily want everything to be coming out of a first fill bourbon cask. Fair enough if that's a distillery's flavour profile, but I personally think that it'd be really interesting if we saw some maybe refill sherry hogsheads coming out of Cotswolds. But for now, we're told that it's going to be no cask finishes and first fill casks on everything. So this whisky in particular, they just call it Cotswold single malt. We know that this has been matured in a combination of first fill bourbon casks and STR casks. So STR casks, we've seen those in a lot of new distilleries' products recently. Knockneen in Scotland and Kingsbarns and a bunch of other distilleries are using these STR. So as I mentioned in other videos, STR stands for shaved toasted recharred, and it's almost always applied to a red wine cask or something similar. So they get these red wine casks and they shave the inside, they toast the casks to reactivate them, and then they rechar them to renew all of that charcoal which filters and matures the whisky on the inside of the cask. Again, not a huge fan of STR casks, but we've seen, especially in the Kingsbarns release, the Dream to Dram bottling, they did work really, really well. So hopeful that it's been a similar experience with this one. So let's get to where it matters. Let's get some in the glass and see what we've got. One final bit of information on this whisky and the Cotswolds distillery in general. Something interesting that they put on their website is that the first cut point when they're distilling this whisky, and I assume all of their whiskies, so their first cut point is at 75%. Now that's very high for a first cut point. There's probably very few people taking a first cut any higher than that. So in theory we should have more of a fruity, estery, maybe slightly lighter, more playful style of whisky. Let's find out. So I'm going to get the bad news out of the way straight away. There is a little bit of an immaturity to the nose on this one, but it's not horrendous. It's young whiskey, and you can tell that it's young whiskey, but it's not bad. You can tell that it's young whiskey that's been handled very well, but it has got a rather distinct gristy spiritiness, and it's a tiny little bit rough. But with that out of the way, let's see what else we can find. So I think you can immediately smell the influence of those STR casks. There's a very strong, sweet, fruity wine gum note on the nose of this one, and that's something that I recognise a lot from STR casks. Something that I can see there's a definite common ground between the STR cask influence in this and what I was getting on the Knockneen whisky. So that fruity wine gum note, it's a little bit simple, a little bit heavy-handed, but it's very pleasant. It's definitely added some character to whiskey. It's not the normal sweetness that you get from a sherry cask or even a bourbon cask. It's definitely a distinct addition from that STR. Also getting some really quite nice notes of fruitcake, a little bit of gingery oak, and a little bit of a slightly plasticine-y note. But apart from the fact that this is young whiskey, there's no getting away from that, I think it's gone really rather well. Something that I do really like about this whiskey is there is a little bit of a dry mineral farmy quality, a little bit of an earthy gristiness, and a little bit of a starchy potatoey note. So these are all things that I'm glad to say are things that I quite often get from St George's Distillery English whiskey releases as well. And it's really nice to see that at least between St George's Distillery and the Cotswolds, and I think you get a little bit of it with Bimber as well, I'm sort of seeing a distinct starchy gristiness and dry minerality that I'm starting to see might possibly be a common defining factor of English whiskey. It'd be really nice if that was the case, because one of the things you don't want with English whiskey, you don't want it to just be a copy of Scotch, because it should have its own national identity and it shouldn't be an imitation of anything. And from seeing those common factors between this and some of the other English distilleries, I think we're starting to get that. One final note on the aroma on this one, and this is a tasting note that I don't use very often at all, but I'm getting a little bit of an aroma of lime pickle on this one. So that's going to be something that's going to be familiar to anyone. I don't know if it's a UK thing, but in the curry houses here, when you have a sit-down meal in a curry house, which must admit I haven't done in a very long time now, you get the little pots of coleslaw and mango chutney and lime pickle, and that lime pickle is not something I like. Every time I go to a curry house, I try a little bit, I think, yep, don't like that, still don't like it. But it's important to challenge yourself. It's important to try new things, and it's just as important if you've tried something before and you didn't like it, but you then come to it and you get another chance to try it years later. It's important to keep challenging your palate. It's how you learn. But yeah, lime pickle, getting a little bit of that on the aroma on the nose in this whiskey. And I must say, I much prefer it as a one little facet and a little bit of added complexity in this whiskey than I do compared to actually eating the thing itself. So yeah, that's an interesting one. But I think the real take home from all of this is I've been giving notes just on the aroma of this whiskey for quite a while now, and I think that's really a credit to this whiskey, because what you don't want with a brand new whiskey, you don't want it to be, it's going to be a little bit rough if it's young whiskey. There's no real getting away from that. But you don't want it to be bland and featureless, and this whiskey is not that. It's got lots of complexity, lots of different facets. There's lots going on there, and to me, even though this is young whiskey, that makes it very enjoyable. So anyway, let's get on with the tasting and see how it tastes. So, in my opinion, I think that the palate on this whiskey is quite a bit better than the nose. Not to say that the nose is bad at all, but I think it really starts to come alive when you actually get to tasting it. As we saw on the nose, on the palate, there's a big burst of sweet wine gum fruitiness and lots of barley notes. Again, slightly harsh, but it is a young whiskey. Quite jammy, sort of jelly babies, jellied confectionery. And I think that's, again, probably coming through from those STR casks. It's going to have another sip. Those upfront flavours, they sort of blend into a more rounded, sweet, lemony, barley malt note. It's also more of that hard, dry, mineral gristiness, which I mentioned before, and I think really might be one of the defining characteristics of English whiskey. I think that the palate is possibly a little bit less complex on this one than the nose, but it's very bold and very flavourful. It's a little bit spicy, and there is quite a bit of wininess. Now, I do hope that once Cotswolds have been making their whiskey for a bit longer, they might either drop the STR casks or at least make more products that don't have that STR influence, because I think that the base spirit on this one will be an absolutely cracking little whiskey at sort of 10, 12 years old, coming from probably just bourbon casks themselves, maybe some refill casks in there. But I can see this one really not needing that crutch of the STR casks when it gets to a slightly higher age. Going to have one more sip and have a look at the finish. So on the finish, it's a little bit hard to describe the length of the finish on this one, because you get some more of those wine gums and sweet fruity spiritiness at the beginning of the finish, and then it tapers off very gradually. And I think the finish, it does have quite a salty, slightly bitterness to it, and a slightly lingering hotness. All in all, as per the nose and the palate, I'm going to say that it's a medium length finish, so pretty good. I do get something on the tail end of the finish on this one. That bitterness, there's a little bit of a bitter herbal quality, and it's almost gin-like in that herbalness, and I'm not going to complain about that. I think that it's different, it's interesting, it's complex, it's something to taste, and it's different to Scotch. It's English whiskey finding its own identity, and that's what it should all be about, being interesting and complex, and this whiskey does that. As for a grade, I'm going to give this one a C+, so that's right at the top end of what I would call good. So there's definitely room for improvement there. I think that the Cotswolds distillery has done an amazing job of starting their whiskey journey. There's definitely plenty of room for improvement above a C+, and I'm 100% confident that it's probably happened already, that the Cotswolds distillery, it was several years ago when they released this one. There's lots of other releases in their portfolio now. I bet if I try some of those other ones, we'll already be well into the B category. I think that this whiskey, if we are assuming that it's 3-4 years old, I would say that it's about the same quality level as we're seeing from St George's English Whiskey Distillery when that was at a similar age. I'd say that this one is not quite as good as Bimber, but Bimber is incredibly small batches. You can't get hold of it anywhere, and Bimber have set an incredibly high bar for the English whiskey world. Whereas with this one, you have to remember that this is a widely available general release. It's not special release, it's not limited edition. You can get it in the supermarkets, you can get it from half a dozen different websites whenever you like, and that definitely counts for something. So me personally, I'm really looking forward to trying some of their other releases. In particular, I'd really love to try some of their peated releases. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this one, and if you've got any thoughts on the Cotswolds distillery or English whiskey in general, let me know in the comments, and I look forward to hearing from you. Cheers.
You